is Tillie Olsen and what makes her a significant American writer? A.O. Scott will be here to discuss the latest subject in his series of essays, The Americans. What can you learn about the Holocaust from a single photograph? Wendy Lauer will join us to talk about the ravine. Alexandra Alter will have an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's March 26th. I'm Pamela Paul. A.O. Scott joins us now to talk about the latest in his series of essays, The Americans. Tony, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
This time around, you chose Tillie Olsen, which is a name that one says, and there's a pause after while people think, like, should I admit that I've never heard of her? Who is Tillie Olsen?
Tillie Olsen is a writer who's best known for a collection of short stories called Tell Me a Riddle, which was published in the early 1960s. The stories appeared in the years before and made quite an impact. And they're stories told in a very compressed, lyrical, kind of modernist style, but the subject matter is very, very realistic and deals mostly with women and working class women kind of and their daily struggles. She also wrote a novel was published that she had written earlier in the 1930s called Yonandayo, which is often taught in university classes now, like in literature of the Depression. It's a book about an itinerant family in the 1930s in the Great Plains in Nebraska and Wyoming, kind of trying to follow the work. And it's also very kind of harsh, naturalistic subject matter, but a very lyrical and beautiful prose style. She kind of spans a lot of the 20th century and is also interesting, I think, because one of her great subjects is how difficult it is to write, about the not writing that gets done, especially by women and by working class women, as she herself was, who are simply often too tired and too overworked and overwhelmed to find the time and space to write.
How did you come across her work?
When I was growing up, I don't know, and I was kind of randomly pulling books off my parents' shelves, which is how I got most of my worthwhile literary education. There was a copy of Tell Me a Riddle, and I don't know why, whether it was like the color of the book jacket or the title or what. It's kind of a revelation because the style is so unusual, or seemed at the time, to me, like nothing I had ever read before. And yet it was also very clear, and it wasn't difficult, but it was sort of strange and intense in a way that I really responded to. And then more recently, one of the reasons that I thought about doing this essay about her in this series was there was a book published last year by Maggie Doherty called The Equivalents, which is about the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard in the 1960s, which was formed as a place for women scholars and artists and writers to gather and to have sort of professional support and to make good on their potential. And Tillie Olsen was one of the early cohort of Radcliffe Fellows. And the book is very interesting. It's about her friendships in particular with the poet Anne Sexton, who was one of the first Radcliffe Fellows. And it had just a lot of interesting things to say about her as a writer and as an influential figure and an important writer, even though her published body of work is very small, 2 books and then a handful of other essays and fragments and some reporting that she did in the 1930s.
Has that been collected into a single volume?
Yeah, there are several collections. So the current edition, or the most recent edition from University of Nebraska of Tell Me a Riddle, includes some of the reporting and some fragments of a longer prose work, which is quite interesting, called Requa. And Yonandayo has been published, and her nonfiction has also been published. There's a very important essay she wrote, which I talk about in the piece, called Silences, which is what she did when she was at the Radcliffe Institute. She kind of went there thinking that she would write a big proletarian novel, sort of in the manner of like Studs Lonigan or Theodore Dreiser or kind of one of those sort of big, sprawling, epic narratives. And instead, she got really interested in why writers don't write, in the internal and external obstacles to literary creation. And so she published an essay in the mid-'60s in Harper's that was eventually retitled Silences. And it's a really interesting, very packed survey of the reasons of sort of famous literary silences that ends with an account of her own life and of just the sort of the difficulties of being a mother of four, working a series of jobs, secretarial jobs, factory jobs, other kinds of, ordinary jobs, and just how the kind of burden on time and talent and mental space that imposes. I think it's a very important and still really intriguing piece of criticism, because it kind of raises a question that we don't think about very much as critics, which is, we think about forgotten works and neglected works and lost works, but we don't think, and we don't even know how to think or have a vocabulary for thinking about unwritten works for the
You've written
the
many
writers.
great unwritten works, right?
Yes, I, like many writers, have a whole shelf of very important unwritten books. Some of my best work is, I'm sure, the work that I didn't do. But that has mostly to do with my own laziness and dilettantism. I wouldn't claim, that it's of any great philosophical importance that I didn't write the 10 books that I should have.
Well, what are some of the reasons that she cites in her essay Silences? This was the 1965 Harper's piece for why other writers, not in her own case, but other writers haven't written.
Well, she kind of surveys it because she starts out with sort of famous silences and, the periods in the lives of famous writers. Dostoevsky is one. She talks about Kafka, Hemingway, that many writers have been blocked or overwhelmed or found, that the sort of the muse had withdrawn. And then she talks about Virginia Woolf and the essay. I mean, Silences in a way is in dialogue with A Room of One's Own, which is Woolf's very important, almost you'd say revolutionary essay about how women have been denied throughout history, the time and space and education and entitlement to write or to do creative work. And she sort of pushes beyond that because Woolf, of course, is writing from a position of relative privilege, able to imagine living in a house that had enough rooms that you could claim one as your own. Whereas a mother of four children in a 3-room apartment doesn't have even the ability to imagine a room of one's own. So she traces in this, I think, very elegant way, a kind of a line from very canonical writers to more marginal or embattled writers to this sort of idea of the people for whom writing is almost impossible. It's so difficult just as a matter of clearing off the table, finding space for the typewriter, finding a few hours to do the work. What's interesting is that she's very insistent that this is not entirely a matter of oppression. She's very proud of her own status as a mother. I mean, she's
Mother of four, right?
A mother of four, yeah. And in her stories, motherhood, the commitments of motherhood, the emotional commitments of motherhood, the hard work of raising and caring for and loving children is very much valued and sort of put as an achievement and as a kind of a vocation in its own right.
One of the titles of her stories is I Stand Here Ironing, which makes me think that story, which was, I think, in the Best American Short Stories in 1957, touches on some of these ideas.
It absolutely does. It's told in the voice of a woman who is standing and ironing and is in conversation either on the phone or with a visitor who is concerned about this woman's oldest daughter. Maybe it's a social worker or a teacher or some kind of concerned official person. And so it's a monologue that's also half of a dialogue and is about this girl and sort of what happened to her and what became of her. This is just the opening passage. I stand here ironing, and what you asked me moves tormented back and forth with the iron. I wish you had managed the time to come in and talk with me about your daughter. I'm sure you can help me understand her. She's a youngster who needs help, and whom I'm deeply interested in helping. Who needs help? Even if I came, what good would it do? You think because I am her mother I have a key, or that in some way you could use me as a key. She has lived for 19 years. There's all that life that has happened outside of me, beyond me. And when is there time to remember, to sift, to weigh, to estimate, to total? I will start, and there will be an interruption, and I will have to gather it all together again. Or I will become engulfed with all I did or did not do, and what should have been and what cannot be helped. She was a beautiful baby, the first and only one of our 5 that was beautiful at birth. You do not guess how new and uneasy her tenancy in her now loveliness. You did not know her all those years. She was thought homely, or see her poring over her baby pictures, making me tell her over and over how beautiful she had been and would be. I would tell her, and was now, to the seeing eye. But the seeing eyes were few to non-existent, including mine.
One of the things you talked about earlier was unwritten work and silences, but what she is writing about often is working class America. And I'm curious, to your mind, who else does that? Who does that well?
When I was reading her this time around, I found myself sometimes thinking about Raymond Carver, who's also from a working class background and also like her from the West, actually. And there is something maybe that they have in common there. And what links them in my mind is a sense of difficulty. Not that they write difficult stories, but in Carver's work, in his best stories, I feel like there's a sense of how hard it is just to get the story out. How even though you're telling a very simple story about something that happened, to a family or to a person or out in the world, just getting it out, getting it as the narrator in the story says, sifted and organized and totaled is enormously hard. And I think that partly has to do with a mistrust of who might be hearing the story, that the world of writing and the world of literature is a very, it's an elite world. And it's a world that might not have room for or might not understand people who are coming from other backgrounds and other places, other regions, other classes, other racial and ethnic backgrounds. So there's, in her work and in Carver's work, kind of maybe hesitancy or suspicion. I mean, I think there are other writers. I mean, I think about writers in the 30s, like James Farrell in the Lonergan trilogy. I don't know if it's as read as it used to be, but it's a powerful account of a working class life and upbringing. And there was also a writer in the 19th century who Olsen herself sort of rediscovered, Rebecca Harding Davis, who wrote a book called Life in the Iron Mills in the early 1860s about factory life. And this was a book that Tillie Olsen kind of brought back into print and made the cornerstone of some of her own teaching when she started teaching at Amherst College and developed some of the first courses kind of in working class American literature. There are, I think, writers out there, certainly, but in a way, it's a different kind of identity, maybe class, than race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality. It can become invisible. It can disappear. People who become writers in a way experience a kind of mobility and maybe a transformation and maybe a loss of that original identity.
Did she?
I think for her, she worked very hard to keep a sense of it. I mean, she certainly just objectively, right? She ended up teaching at Amherst College, which is not known as a sort of a proletarian place.
Right.
By any means. But I think she was very insistent on keeping it as part of her own identity as a writer, as sort of a counterpart in a way to her feminism. And I think it was partly a matter of not forgetting where she had come from, the very hard childhood that she'd had.
Let's talk about that for a minute.
She was born in Nebraska. Her parents were Jewish immigrants, and the life that they lived is more or less captured in Onondaga, which was, itinerantly looking for work in mining towns and slaughterhouses and traveling and finding the work. In a way, Onondaga and that story reminds me a lot of the first writer that I wrote about in this series, Wallace Stegner, and his great novel, Big Rock Candy Mountain, which is about an itinerant Western childhood in, around the same time, maybe a little earlier, but they're more or less contemporaries. And the sense of struggle and rootlessness. She found her way finally to San Francisco in the Depression, where she met and married Jack Olsen and worked as a labor organizer, was involved in and wrote kind of an amazing dispatch from the San Francisco General Strike in 1934, which was one of the big moments of labor militancy in the Great Depression. And she was beaten up by the police and arrested. There was always a very strong political dimension to her writing and to her sense of what writing was. This was sort of the other thing I was going to say, that she kept an idea of herself as a working class writer by understanding writing as work, as not necessarily distinct from other kinds of work, whether it's the emotional labor and domestic work of raising children or wage labor in an office or a factory. It's all work.
What was the critical reception of her writing at that time?
She found a sort of moment in the late 50s and early 60s. Her stories won prizes and recognition, and the book Tell Me a Riddle, which is really 3 stories and a novella, was pretty widely acclaimed, and those stories also brought her to the attention of Radcliffe and got her into the Radcliffe Institute. So she was somebody also of whom more was expected. I think there was an anticipation of further work. She was already in her 40s and 50s at that time. I mean, she had a long period of not writing and of not publishing before those first stories were published.
You have a lot of writers, obviously, to choose from for this series. You picked her for a reason. It sounds like you think people should read her now. Why?
I think people should read her now, I think for a few different reasons. I was really drawn to the sort of this idea of the difficulty of writing and the ways that our other responsibilities and the fatigue of living can make it hard to write. I think I related to this very much in this year. I mean, one of the things that comes back again and again, one of the themes in her stories is tiredness, is just the kind of like physical and mental fatigue of being alive and how hard that can make it to create anything.
This feels like a quarantine essay, Tony.
Well, they all are, right? I mean, so I related to that quite a lot. But I also thought we've been thinking and arguing a lot in the last few years in the political sphere about class and what that means. And there's also been a lot of discussion about gender, about women and women's writing. And I thought that her take on those two themes and the relationship between them was just really interesting and felt timely and also untimely in the way that I think is always best with writers. That, when they're not talking exactly to the present, but they're writing in ways that give you a new perspective on it. So I was thinking too about just, the work of care and domestic work and raising children and ironing clothes and what has historically been thought of as women's work, and what a big part of life that becomes when you're in your house.
I was going to say, very timely for all of us.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, Tony, always a pleasure to have you.
It was a lot of fun, Pamela. Thank you.
Tony Scott is the chief film critic of the New York Times, and he is writing a series of essays for us on the Americans. This year, the New York Times Book Review celebrates its 125th anniversary. Joining us now to talk about it, Tina Jordan.
Hey, Pamela. So what I've brought you today are the very beginnings of the bestseller list from 1907. In 1907, the Times would send reporters around to all the big New York City bookstores to ask them what was selling. One of these booksellers, who's unnamed in the story, decides to school the reporter and says, "Listen, let me explain. There are about 2,500 new novels issued every year." That's kind of mind-blowing to me that there are only 2,500. And the average sale is something like 500 copies each. Some novels go beyond that. A novel that reaches a sale of 25,000 copies is doing extremely well. I would say that's true today, wouldn't you? 25,000 copies?
Yes.
Anyway, goes on to talk about books like The House of Mirth, which have sold 75,000. Books like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which the bookseller says sold 2 million copies in the decade since it had been published. But then the bookseller says, but look, if you want to know what really sells, you have to go way further back in time. And what he was talking about was both Shakespeare and the Bible. And here's where my heart broke a little bit, because when the Times asked the bookseller how many copies of Shakespeare his store sold every year, he said, "In this single store, we rarely go below 5,000 volumes of his plays every year, and there's not a bookstore in the world that does not keep them in stock on account of the constant demand for them." He went on to guesstimate that around 2 million copies were sold each year of Shakespeare's plays, but Then he said, but what is that compared with the almost incredible record of sale of the Bible? So the Times dived right into this and tried to figure out how many copies of the Bible were sold and said it was just about impossible because so many different companies published the Bible. But it did its best, and it came up with a worldwide sales figure of between 14 and 15 million copies and says, thus, the daily average of Bibles sold, 10,000, is equal to the yearly sales of a bestseller in fiction.
I wonder what the sales of the Bible are today.
I do too. I think it's worth finding out. But I was just sort of fascinated that a novel that sold well back then sold 25,000 copies.
I'm fascinated. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Pamela. Talk to you next week.
Wendy Lauer joins us now from New Haven. She is the author of Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, and her new book is called The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed. Wendy, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
This book begins, and it centers on a photograph. And since we can't see it here on the podcast, would you describe to us what it shows?
In the photograph, we see the act of genocide being carried out against a Jewish family, standing over what looks like a ravine. It's in broad daylight, and you can just see the earth, you can see the trees, and there's kind of a blotchiness. The light is passing through the trees in the background. The woman is standing in a polka dotted dress with these Mary Jane shoes and stockings. She's holding a little boy's hand, and he's barefooted and he's kneeling and kind of falling into the grave. She's bent over. Her back is facing the killers, and the killers are a band, a kind of gang of German officers. They're in uniform, and then some militia, local militia, wearing what I just determined were Red Army coats, repurposed coats, and they've got armbands on, and there's an onlooker, a witness. In the foreground, we can see some empty shoes, and it looks like some papers or some cloth and a coat, a crumpled coat, a man's coat that's empty. And then in the immediate foreground there, closest to us, we can see the casings of the bullets, a kind of litter of mass murder. And it's clearly an action shot because of the smoke that is kind of haloing above the woman's head, which ballistics experts would explain to me as part of the effect of a mass shooting, of simultaneous shooting, one after the other. That's why that smoke is in the center of the image.
How did you come across this picture?
Well, it came to me. In 2009, I was working at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum archives. I was actually working on another investigation of an SS officer who was still alive in Germany. And my colleague, who knew I was an expert on Ukraine, was in the archives as well. He was greeting two journalists who had come from Prague, who traveled from Prague, and they brought with them this photograph. And they wanted to find out more about it. They were as shocked when they uncovered it in what was the kind of KGB-like authority in the former Czechoslovak Republic. They found that there had been sitting there for decades, was not on display. It was just one of these kind of unknown atrocity images from the Holocaust. So I was there. They brought it over to me. They turned it over and showed me that there was a handwriting on the back that said that it had been taken, written down that it had been taken in Mariupol, Ukraine, October 13th, 1941. And they also had the name of the photographer who had been interrogated about this image on numerous occasions. He was Slovakian.
How common was this kind of photo at the time, and how many survived?
Well, these are rare photographs. Most people think that, first of all, most people think that we know all there is to know about the Holocaust. And this is an important example of how these records are just being declassified now from the various countries that were involved in the Holocaust or occupied by the Nazis. This is a so-called kind of collaborator image as far as the Slovak photographer. So we have yet to see a lot of these images emerge. They've been suppressed or they've been destroyed. When you go to Holocaust museums or you look in textbooks, we tend to see the same images that have become iconic. And I can list them. There are a dozen or so that we are familiar with. They become kind of a stand-in for our knowledge when we look at them, and part of our collective memory of an historical disaster, widely circulated and displayed, but with little information about the circumstances or persons pictured in them, and usually even less about the photographer. So when I saw this as the act of murder, I was pretty sure that this was something that was rare. When you just think about the images of the Holocaust that come to mind, usually it's the gates of Birkenau, or images of corpses during the liberation, or Jews being brought, to these sites of murder, being deported, but not the actual murder taking place, the culmination of the genocide.
Why are these archives only being declassified now? And I'm curious, how cooperative are the various countries where these archives are held in terms of revealing this information?
Well, each European country has a different rules as far as when documents can be declassified that are considered sensitive or secretive, or somehow going to interfere with the security of the state, or privacy laws of individuals, for instance. So the various countries have different rules. It can be anywhere, up to 70 years. It's usually kind of the lifetime of the person in the photograph to protect privacy. Now, this particular image taken by the Slovakian photographer, was part of an investigation in the Czechoslovak Republic after the war, but as I said, not put on display. Now, the privacy laws for archives are, if you think about it, it's been 75 years, more or less, since the end of the war. And so things are just starting to come out now. And some of the biggest archives that have come out, like the ITS, the International Tracing Service archive in Germany, that was a struggle to get that opened, all those survivor records and IDs, and things came up. Like, for instance, in those personnel records, you might identify someone as being a victim of the Nazi regime because they were accused of being, say, a homosexual, right? And that would then bring up issues of privacy, right? Other impediments concern, for instance, in Germany, the case against the main Himmler apparatus, the entire terror apparatus, the Reich Security Main Office, a huge investigation in the 60s. And we're still trying to get those records declassified because descendants of those who were accused of these crimes don't want their name out in the public realm as being descendants of Nazi war criminals, right? So it can get down to kind of a file by file review. Or in some countries like Ukraine, when I first went there in 1992, they had completely open access. And I was looking at cases that had to do with Ukrainian collaborators and police. And then when I went back in 2016, those records had been classified. They had been closed because it was considered kind of a shame to the nation. It was a kind of history that the Ukrainians didn't want on full display. So then it became more difficult to access these records.
But this is evidence of a crime in this photo.
Right. I've gone through thousands of files of investigations on both Germans and Ukrainians. And this is one of the reasons why this image really stood out, is because the kinds of techniques of the defendants, as far as suppression, obfuscation, outright lying about their participation, who is doing the shooting, who is at the scene. And when you look at this photo, it's, you can't deny the fact that the Germans are shooting, the bullets are coming out of the ends of their barrels of their guns, as well. The Ukrainian is standing there, his face, he's grimacing, he's gripping the gun, the blast is occurring. And so this is, obviously a very important photograph as far as, the incontrovertible evidence of who did what to whom on a day in a location.
So, this book is in large part about that investigation. You're trying to figure out who are the victims, what happened, who are the perpetrators, who took this picture, when and where. What did you find out?
Well, I analyzed this over years, and I kind of picked apart each element of the photograph, which kind of is how the book is constructed, both the discovery process as well as the elements of this photograph that provide us with another facet, another understanding of the history of the Holocaust. So it is an attempt at historical justice and redress and memorialization as far as trying to restore the memory of the victims and their lives. So in the image, as I mentioned before, you see the natural setting. You see how the Nazis put the landscape to use and the agency of this ravine or rivers, or, in the history of the Holocaust, the use of, Babi Yar is probably the most famous ravine, but just how the Nazis outside the killing system of the camps actually went into these local communities, these shtetls, and actually used whatever was available kind of in an ad hoc way, including these local militia who were requisitioned kind of on the spot. In fact, these killers were all volunteer killers. So I went through the photograph and picked apart the role of the landscape, the environmental history. In the image in the center, we see the family. What does this mean in the history of genocide? Lemkin talks about various groups that are targeted. What does it mean to be in genealogy of this history, to be that family member and to have experienced that pain and suffering with your loved ones, or the fact that these killers are determined to wipe out every family, every root and branch kind of genocide, that level of determination to destroy. And then, of course, the men together shooting the woman with the child, and what are the gendered elements of this, right? And why are these men who are standing shoulder to shoulder, Ukrainian, German, they can't speak the same language, but they understand something. They have this shared anti-Semitism, and the violence of that. And then in the foreground, the empty shoes. And what does that mean? The kind of absence there, the empty shoes and the crumpled coat exists there as questions, as gaps in our knowledge, and remind us of the victims whom we cannot see and the many who were murdered and remain missing.
You started off by saying, many people think we know what there is to know about the Holocaust. And when people think about the Holocaust, they do, as you pointed out, really think about the camps and not about these kinds of killings, this Holocaust by bullets that took place in the Ukraine and elsewhere. Could you just give a bit of background about what that looked like?
Well, this image is definitely a clear example of that kind of way of genocide, of mass murder. And it's important to not only research this, because that part of the killing system that the Nazis created was very sparsely documented. When the victims are not, registered, put on trains, and their apartments, kind of listed and then reoccupied and plundered, like that whole machinery of destruction, which was the West European kind of example of whereby the Nazis transported the victims to their murder sites in this way. There's opportunity for documentation there. For an historian, you can go into the bureaucratic records and piece together what happened, and even find extensive lists of names. In this case, where the killers go to the victims in these small localities, in these rural settings, where they show up on the scene, they march them to the edge of town, they kill them immediately. They don't make any lists. They just grab their belongings and they repurpose their belongings. They're buried, and they become kind of the local secret of that community, because it's done in broad daylight and you have all these witnesses, which is what took me back to that location and what, inspired me to go back and start to talk to the Ukrainians who knew these Jews. I mean, the Ukrainian killers in this image knew these were their Jewish neighbors. They called them out by name. The Germans, of course, didn't know who they were. Every fourth victim who died in the Holocaust resided in what is the borders of Ukraine today. So, it deserves our attention to look, more closely at this. And some of my colleagues have, and I've been working with them. So I'm not the first to do this, but I could establish I'm the first person to look very closely at a photograph and photography and as evidence in this historical chapter, in this element of the genocide.
When we talk about who was guilty of these murders, there are obviously the people in the photograph, but you write about the many people who were involved in this, who either directly or indirectly as collaborators. Can you give a sense, again, maybe taking us back to when you went to this town, to Paul, and sort of figured out who was exactly involved in these events?
The history of collaboration is incredibly complex, and there's a lot of discussion about it today because it's a politically very sensitive topic. And some of my colleagues in Poland, for instance, are being investigated and criminalized for working on the topic of the Polish police, the Blue Police, who were active in Nazi-occupied Poland and in rounding up Jews and hunting them down and denouncing them and turning them over to the Germans.
Your colleagues are getting into trouble for pointing out this kind of collaboration?
Oh, yeah, for researching it. It's bringing shame on the nation. Jan Grabowski and Barbara Engelking and the historical community has come out, including the American Historical Association, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Pretty much every professional historical association around the world, including Israel, has come out in support of our Polish colleagues who are facing this kind of persecution, really, and intimidation. And so this is something that in this post-Soviet context of the newly independent Ukraine and the restored Polish nation want to tell a history that garners pride. And this is a shameful history, right? In their mind or in their interpretation. And so there's, systematic attempts to kind of repress this and go after the scholars who do this kind of research decades on, and we see this in Turkey as well, right? So there's the history of genocide and there's a history of those who seek to suppress it and deny it. So this particular image, I'm curious to see what's going to happen, right? And as far as Ukrainian responses to my work and to the publication of this image, because it's just, again, it's so undeniable what's happening here with the Ukrainians, their participation, their direct role. There were like 100,000 Ukrainians in these stationary police units. The Germans did not have the manpower on the ground to carry out these mass shootings, and they wanted to deploy their able-bodied men in other positions to fight the war on the front, on the military front. So increasingly over the course of the war, they were drawing from local collaborators, from whether they're Hungarian or Polish or Ukrainian, to carry out these hunts for Jews and these shootings. So this is really epitomizes this actual history outside the camp system.
What do we know about the murderers in this photograph and what happened to them?
First of all, the photograph was not available to investigators outside of Prague. So the Slovakian photographer, goes back to Banská Bystrica and is interrogated about it, but it's not shared with Soviet investigators in Ukraine who were aggressively going after collaborators. They called them traitors to the homeland, and they were rounding them up and their families in the thousands and processing them and prosecuting them. But that photo wasn't available. And likewise in Germany, the photo was not available. So in West Germany in 1969, one of the members of this unit, who's not pictured here, they're customs guards. These guys are, typically checking packages at the railway station or in the post office. This is completely not what they were trained to do. But what happened was there was no SS office or real police station in this small town. And so the neighboring office of the SS, the officer came into town on a Sunday night, as it was described by someone who testified after the war on the German side, and just said, as these West German, who become West Germans, these German customs guards during the war, are sitting around playing cards, playing Scott, it's a German card game, in their canteen, and this SS officer shows up on a Sunday night and says, who wants to volunteer to carry out an Aktion, as they call it, who wants to shoot Jews tomorrow? And so it's that kind of on-the-spot recruiting. And then these two Germans who were notorious in the group, two or three of them said, Jawohl, I will volunteer. I want to get involved in this. And lo and behold, there they are, the two who were denounced in 1969 by one of the former comrades in that customs unit. This man went into a police station near Hanover, Germany, and in January, and said, "I'd like to report a crime." And then the man at the desk on duty just pulled out his generic form for a police report and typed up what would become a description of the event we're seeing here in the photograph.
And what happened?
They were interrogated for about a year. It was a pretty pro forma investigation, kind of routine, but it did yield some good details from other people in that unit. And one of the men in the photograph could not be found, and the other one was questioned. And it was just a really incredible experience to compare the photograph with this West German who just completely denied shooting. He described what happened, but then he said, well, I wasn't really there. I heard about it, and all of those kinds of shenanigans. But there were other details that came out from his comrades that helped me fill out the picture of what happened that day. I should mention, unlike the West German investigation, perhaps a little bit more kind of satisfying as someone seeking some sort of justice here 70 years later, was the fact that the Ukrainians were tracked down late in the 80s, mid 80s, and shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So during the period of perestroika and glasnost in the late 80s, a Ukrainian prosecutor in Zhytomyr found these militiamen and arrested them, and they were convicted. They were executed by firing squad in January 1987. And one of them was sent into the Russian prison system, into interior Russia, He was 17 years old when he committed the crimes in 41. So as a minor, he got 15 years. I don't know what happened to him. Ukraine got its independence in August 91. So, this case is 87 and Ukraine gets its independence in 91 and I'm in the archives in 92. And so that history of the Ukrainians is interesting. It's one of the last trials. And again, they didn't have this photograph, but the Ukrainian case was really impressive. The Soviet Ukrainian case, as far as they reconstructed the details of the crime, and it matches, really almost perfectly with the image here that we see. So that was a case in a way of justice. I think it's important for people to know that, that the long arm of the law did eventually extend to those Ukrainians in the image.
Why is it important in your view that we look at photographs like this?
Well, every image of genocide, like this one, is a warning to us as to how far ideologies of hate, such as racism, can go and have gone in subjugating the innocent and devaluing human life and allowing state-sponsored violence to lead to mass murder. And the power of this photograph, and in fact, the photographer turned out to be a resistance fighter, and this was his enough moment. This was his turning point, which one would not assume upon, first look at this image. You'd say, oh my gosh, this is not a clandestine image. This is so clear. And this person is taking this openly and is wearing a uniform. So he must have also been part of this gang of collaborators. But in fact, it's not so. So first of all, it's the power of observation and choosing to look at this when there is this kind of evidence to kind of reclaim the truth and to just study it. And if you really focus on it, you will discover pieces of history that will surprise you, like the resistance of the photographer or the ability to track down these killers. And then the other surprise for me was actually not as satisfying, was more frustrating. And that was that I couldn't actually, with 100% certainty, identify the victims. And that was something I was trying, I was really determined, wanting to restore their identities, to overturn what the genociders seek, which is this kind of suppression and erasure. And although I didn't succeed in that, the act of researching this and reconstructing the before and the during and the after of this photo was in some ways my effort to speak to the victims in this photo, that kind of redress, and also to establish for broader audiences that this is what happened and now this is what we know happened to you, and that we take this image as that kind of a warning of what can happen, and that perhaps other victim groups who come across such photography of their own plight. I asked in the beginning of the book, what would you do if you found an atrocity from decades ago, like the image of a lynching? What is your ethical obligation when you have such an image in your hand? What do you do with that, and the agency of the photograph to set these things in motion of discovery and justice?
It's a very powerful testimony and an important history. Wendy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wendy Lauer's book is called The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, Holocaust Massacre Revealed. Joining us now with some news in the publishing world, Alexandra Alter. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela. So this week, Penguin Random House announced that they're going to be extending some help to independent bookstores, which have really been struggling during the pandemic, as we've discussed a number of times on this podcast. They're the biggest publishing company in the United States. And so this will have, I think, a pretty significant impact on independent sellers. They're going to allow these bookstores to take an additional month to pay their invoices. And I think, this is mutually advantageous for a number of reasons. It might slow down the rate of returns. For example, when bookstores have unsold inventory, they send it back to the publisher. The publisher has to take all these unsold copies and pulp them. It's very sort of an inefficient system. It might also just give these stores a cushion, since Penguin Random House publishes so many of the top sellers. They're huge. And so a lot of the books that independent stores are buying are probably coming from this company. It will get even bigger when they acquire Simon & Schuster, if that goes through later this year. By, extending this payment period for independent stores, I think it could really help them kind of squeak by during the pandemic, which has been really devastating to these smaller stores, even as the whole market has been doing extremely well.
I wonder if people are going to return to their earlier book buying habits when this is all over. I guess the big question is, will the bookstores still be there for them to do that?
Yeah, it's a huge question mark. I mean, right now, the latest numbers show that for 2020, bookstore sales fell by almost 30% from 2019. And this is in a period where print sales are up, ebooks and audiobooks are up, but hardcover, paperback, all formats, children's, adults, people are buying and reading a lot more than they did before the pandemic. It's just the way that they're buying their books has changed so much. So a lot of them are shopping online, either at Amazon or sometimes at Walmart or Target or barnesandnoble.com. A lot of independent stores have really upped their game for online retail. So that's been an interesting avenue for them, but it doesn't make up for those in-store sales, particularly with the loss of author tours and those kinds of events that would really draw in crowds. I think that's been really hard, not to mention independent stores that have cafes or they sell gifts, toys, greeting cards, all that business is also down.
I guess it's like so many other things. People will want to go to restaurants and they'll want to go to movie theaters and they'll want to go to bookstores, and just hopefully all those places will still be around for us to go to.
I hope so too. Yeah, I think for publishers and for authors, they're holding their breath because, independents are such a critical piece of the ecosystem in terms of helping people find new authors, helping publishers sort of develop authors' careers. There's, nothing like going into a store and having somebody hand sell you a book and say, you have to read this. Or you can ask, if I love Susanna Clark, what should I read next? And they'll give you somebody you've never heard of. So I think for those reasons and maybe some others involving the merger, Penguin Random House is very wise to kind of help support that part of the ecosystem.
And also buying books by their covers,
Yes, I
buying
know.
books by their covers, letting children wander around and pick up books that are interesting to them. Just that random discovery that you get in a bookstore. Let's bring all of that back.
Yes, I agree.
All right, Alexandra, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now are critics Parul Sehgal and Jennifer Szalai. Hi there.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Parul, what did you read and review this week?
I had a very good week. I reviewed 100 Boyfriends by Brontes Purnell, who is this polymathic artist. He's a dancer. He created a couple of cult zines back in the 90s. He's directed documentaries and he writes fiction. He's written children's books and novellas and novels. And his new book is, I don't know, it's this like funny, filthy taxonomy of boyfriends. It's of meeting men, falling in love with men, being jilted by men in these short little vignettes. And I mean, it's a book he's a writer I've always been interested in. But in this particular case, one of the reasons I wanted to review the book is that I was so frustrated by the other reviews it was getting, and because it came out a few weeks ago, and I was reading all these other reviews, and they were just treating it in a very strange way. They were talking about it like it was a memoir, like it was a work of theory. And it's not to say that those elements don't course through this novel. He definitely draws from life in certain ways you can imagine. It's close to his experience. The book is set in Oakland. It's, features a lot of characters that also, like Purnell, grew up in Alabama or Gen X, but that's just some of them. And it's a work of fiction. It's a work of imagination. It's a work of considerable artistry. And so I think I wanted to write something that brought us back to the actual sentences and the characters, and also didn't treat the book like it was some sort of think piece about gayness and blackness today. It has, ideas and thoughts and engages with those, identities and stuff like that. But it's also about characters. It's about imagination. It's about the work of fiction. And so I kind of wanted to write the review that I wanted to read of the book.
Does that happen to you often? Like, do you read other criticism and then sort of say like, okay, now let me,
in the words of Martin Amis, pull my pen from the scabbard? No.
Yes.
I mean, I'm a fairly cranky person, and especially when it comes to writers that I and artists that I care about. But no, generally our reviews run so early, we don't have a chance to read much else, But in this case, and in a few other cases, it definitely has happened where you sort of feel like something has not been said. And there's a place for you to sort of come in with a review even slightly later, but that does engage with the book in a particular kind of way that you think is important.
See, I'm so curious about that. Like, Jen, do you want to read what other people think before you review a book, or do you try and like keep your mind pure and unadulterated and uninfluenced, or how does that work?
Well, I mean, I think as Parul pointed out, it's often the case that our reviews appear so early that, there hasn't really been anything or much that's written about the book. If there has been something, I mean, I guess it depends. I mean, it sounds like, Parul, from what you're saying with Purnell's book, the book came out a few weeks ago. You saw some of the reviews and realized that there was something that wasn't really getting talked about. And I think that can occasionally happen, but for the most part, it does seem to be the case that for my own reviews, especially if they're coinciding with the publication date, there won't be much that's been written. And if there has been something written, sometimes I will really not want to read it because on the one hand, I do want to know what other people are saying. On the other hand, I also really want to focus on what I think, how I respond to it without other people's opinions yet. Yeah, so I guess it's a case-by-case basis.
And I remember when I was sort of like a baby critic writing about film, it was terrifying to sort of not know in a way what anyone thought pre-internet and pre-screener, and everyone would go into the screening room and, leave in total silence, very poker-faced. And I didn't know other critics at the time. So I don't know. It's an interesting question.
I mean, there's something freeing about that in a way, though, right?
Yes.
I mean, that you can just say what you think.
Say what you actually think. Fancy that. No, I know, but it's nerve-wracking when you're young.
It totally is. But then you think about somebody like Pauline Kael, whose reviews didn't run especially early, and her reviews would frequently review the reviews, which I actually think is also really interesting. I like your question about keeping our minds pure. Whose mind is pure? I don't know if it's going to become adulterated by a couple of reviews.
These works, whether they're works of nonfiction or works of art or, they come into, there is a conversation that happens around them. And I think that conversation is often very interesting. And it can be really interesting when a lot of people are talking about a book in a way that you totally disagree with. So I think in that sense, it can be really helpful and can also clarify your own thinking, your own feeling about something.
Now I want like the opposite. I want like a critic fight or something, or like a post. Everyone writes their reviews and then they get into a circle and sort of brawl it out.
Well, we can oblige.
Yeah, I was going to say, we could try to do that.
Not a stretch here.
Jen, what did you write about?
I reviewed a book called Until Justice Be Done by Kate Mazer, and she's a historian at Northwestern. And her subtitle is America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. And so I think right there you sort of get at what she's trying to do with this book, which is basically say that in addition to the civil rights movement that I think everybody is familiar with of the 50s and 60s and the 20th century, she's looking at a time before the Civil War mainly, when not only was there the fight against slavery, the fight for abolition, but there was also, as she points out, a fight for racial equality. And a lot of that was taking place in what were ostensibly the free states, but a number of them had also enacted what were called Black laws, which were essentially laws that were designed to discourage the settlement and mobility of Black Americans. And so she looks at people who were fighting against this, and African Americans were leading this fight, but they also had white allies, and their white allies sort of varied in terms of how far they were willing to go in terms of what they considered racial equality in that time. It's interesting because she takes part in a number of conversations, and one of the conversations that historians have been having is this question of the Constitution and whether for antebellum activists, whether the Constitution provided an obstacle to abolitionist efforts or whether it actually provided an opening, a way for activists to fight against racial discrimination. And so she looks at the different ways that these activists really tried to push for equality, and, they used every means at their disposal. So on the one hand, yes, they tried to fight for a more capacious understanding of citizenship and freedom and personal liberty. But on the other hand, some of them did try to use the states' rights argument, which was also very interesting to see how, the rights of one state, like a freeborn resident of New York, for example, could use that argument to fight against being thrown into jail in Washington, D.C., which was a slave state. So I think that this book really enriches our understanding of that era. It also, I think, takes part in another conversation, which we often have, which is about, how activism works and whether incrementalism can achieve anything. Because I think that there is sometimes this notion that, unless you achieve everything at once, whatever small gains are made can be easily reversed. And she definitely does show the complexity of that. She does show that that did happen. But at the same time, there is something, even though this is a very sobering book, I should make that very clear, there is a certain hopefulness to it too, where she does show how people did manage to win certain hard-won gains and then use those to push for even more.
It does feel like this book is part of a kind of thematic sequence of books that you've been reading and reviewing in the past year to 2 years.
Yes, well, there was a book that I reviewed fairly recently. I think it might have been toward the end of last year, which was, it was sort of obliquely connected, but I think, again, looking at the question of the Constitution and slavery, and it was a book about people who had brought freedom suits against governments and people who were enslaved who fought for their freedom through the courts. So essentially, again, making arguments that slavery and enslavement wasn't constitutional, or that the way that it was carried out wasn't allowed by the Constitution. And so again, I think that this is a conversation that historians are having, and also this question of whether the Constitution itself was a pro-slavery or anti-slavery document is still a contested issue among historians. And again, I think this is just an ongoing conversation that we're seeing unfold.
All right, I am going to segue to a conversation that many of us have amongst ourselves, and one of our listeners has written in asking us to talk about it. And that is essentially, when do you give up on a book and whether you feel guilty when you do that? Carol Paxton writes, "My brother has a rule. If he's not grabbed in 50 pages, he's done with it. I have no rule. I just let books languish half read. How about you all?" And then she adds a second question, another big one. Also, how do you decide what to read in your spare time? I'm often perplexed by your choices, which I love. I love that we're confusing people with the randomness of our taste. Parul, let's start with you. Like, when do you put something down?
It's such an interesting question because, I love quitting things. I love giving up. But yet, I think I really do. I'm like a bitter ender when it comes to the books. I very rarely stop reading. And I think that maybe just, it might be a function of because I have to be so careful in my free time that the books I pick up I really want to read, have wanted to read. There's some compelling reason. But yeah, I think I especially fiction, I think I always, because with fiction, one never knows, right? Like the first 50 pages can be so dull. And then on page 51, there's some fantastic twist. I don't know. So yeah, I tend to stick with things. And then in my free time, it's like an appetite for me, I think, like you have a yen or a hankering for something, and that's, I think, how it goes. But I also reread a lot, and I think I've talked about this before on this podcast. I used to have this rule, for every new book I had to go back and reread something. And so I actually think it's sometimes I think I read things that in a way complement what I've just finished reviewing, right? I tend to review very grim books. I like a sad memoir. I like a lot of dysfunction. And so I have, I'll read a cozy book, or I'll reread something that I associate with sort of comfort, something lighter. So I think happens, but mostly it feels just random, it's sort of like you wake up wanting to read something that a sharp essay or, a biography, or you need a little Janet Malcolm, you need a little something like this. So yeah, it's a little appetite based for me. What about you, Jen?
In terms of the first question about giving up on books, I do give up on books. And it's interesting because I've had conversations with friends who just won't, as you said, Parul, like that that there is sort of this notion that it's like you never know what's going to happen. And it is true. Probably my approach to fiction is different than nonfiction. I might be willing to give fiction more of a chance, usually. Often with nonfiction, you can tell fairly early on if the author is doing something that you find interesting, worthwhile, that you want to pursue. But ultimately, I wouldn't say that I have a rule necessarily, like the person I think mentioned in the email who gives up after 50 pages. I think isn't there a critic, maybe Parul, you can help me with this, wasn't there somebody who said that you read the first page and the 90th page and then you decide? Or am I just making this up?
I love that, though. That would speed things up considerably.
Yeah, I don't know why it's the 90th page, but anyway. And then, in terms of my spare time, it feels extremely random to me. And so when the writer said that she felt perplexed by our choices, I feel like sometimes I feel perplexed by my own choices. And again, yes, it definitely depends on mood. And, I feel like this past year especially, it's like I don't know. I don't know. I feel like my mood everything has sort of been a bit of a blur. And so it really just depends day to day what I feel like reading. And I think in terms of my own, in terms of my job and what I review for the paper, it's often a very particular kind of book. Not only is it nonfiction, but a lot of it, especially the last year, has been very political. And so I would say that my free time reading is often not those books. But otherwise, yes, it just really depends on how I'm feeling on a particular day.
I've picked up this new quarantine habit of pausing with books that I didn't used to do. I have 2 books on pause right now, both of which I intend to finish, both of which I was enjoying. One of them was Travels in Siberia by Ian Fraser. The other one is The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. But I've been having this feeling when I'm reading, and maybe it's because we have so little choice in quarantine of what to do, that this is the one way in which I can kind of walk out of a show, or I don't know, just decide to take a different bus to another location. It's commute a different route. There's just so little choices. And I do feel like, because for me, quarantine has been total stasis, there's some points where I'm reading, I was recently reading this book, Yoga by Emmanuel Carrere. And, there's a point where he's very depressed and he's in a mental institution. And I was like, I don't want to be in here. I don't want to be in here right now. So I don't know if it's, if either of you have kind of had that feeling of we have so little control and so little choice right now that it feels all the more important to kind of exercise some kind of, I don't know.
To take a stand.
To take a stand. Have some small bit of power.
I like that.
No, I'm alone. Okay, let's run down the titles again. Jen, you reviewed?
I reviewed Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction by Kate Mazer.
Parul?
And I reviewed 100 Boyfriends by Brontes Purnell.
All right, Jen, Parul, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.